Faceless Crimes. The Writer Who Couldn't Stop. June 1981. A convicted killer walks out of prison after more than a decade behind bars. He's not walking out quietly. He's walking out to magazine profiles, television appearances, and a table at a fancy New York party. Because in the months before his release, some of the most respected literary voices in America decided he wasn't just a criminal. He was a genius who deserved a second chance. 6 weeks later, he's wanted for murder again. This is Faceless Storyteller, and this is Faceless Crimes, the series where we look past the headlines and into the people behind history's most disturbing cases, one story at a time. Today, Jack Henry Abbott, the convict-turned-author, whose prison letters made him a literary sensation, and whose freedom lasted just long enough to end another man's life. Jack Henry Abbott was born January 21st, 1944, on a U.S. Army base in Michigan, the son of an American soldier and a Chinese mother. There was no stable childhood waiting for him. He moved through foster homes, and by the time he was 12 years old, he'd already been placed in a school for delinquent boys. By 16, he was in a reform school. The pattern was set early, and it never really broke. In 1963, at 19 years old, Abbott was convicted of forgery, writing bad checks, and sent to the Utah State Penitentiary. It was inside those walls, in 1965, that Abbott stabbed a fellow inmate to death during a prison altercation. You totally deserve it. He was handed a sentence of 3 to 20 years for the killing, on top of what he was already serving. Prison didn't calm him down. In 1971, Abbott escaped and robbed a bank in Denver, Colorado. He was caught, convicted of armed robbery, and hit with a 19-year federal sentence stacked on top of everything else. Behind bars, he was defiant, refusing orders, clashing with guards, spending huge stretches of his sentence in solitary confinement. By any measure, Jack Abbott was exactly the kind of inmate the system expected to die in prison. Then, in 1977, everything changed. Not because of anything Abbott did, but because of what he read. He came across a newspaper article about Norman Mailer, one of the most celebrated writers in America, who was working on a book about condemned killer Gary Gilmore. Abbott wrote to Mailer directly, offering something Mailer didn't have: an insider's account of what prison actually felt like, from a man living deep inside its worst corners. Mailer was struck by what came back. Abbott's letters were handwritten, often 20 pages or more, and Mailer found them genuinely, unmistakably talented. The New York Review of Books published excerpts. A young Random House editor signed Abbott to a book deal. The letters became a book, In the Belly of the Beast, a raw, unflinching account of life inside America's prison system. Mailer didn't stop at publishing him. He became Abbott's advocate for parole, telling the board Abbott was rehabilitated, telling them he personally would guarantee the man a job as a research assistant the moment he walked free. In June 1981, it worked. Jack Abbott, 21 years deep into a life shaped almost entirely by incarceration, was released to a halfway house in Manhattan. For a few weeks, he was improbably the toast of New York's literary world. He appeared on Good Morning America. He was invited to parties most working writers would never see the inside of. Critics were already lining up to praise In the Belly of the Beast before it even hit shelves. Norman Mailer had found, in his own words to friends, something like his own Gary Gilmore, a real convict whose voice validated everything he'd tried to capture in fiction. All Abbott had to do was stay out of trouble for 8 weeks. He didn't make it 6. On the night of July 17th, 1981, Abbott was at a small restaurant in the East Village called the Binnibon, sitting with 2 women. He got up to use the bathroom and was told by a 22-year-old waiter, Richard Eden, that the restroom was for staff only. Restaurant policy, tied to insurance rules that didn't cover our customers in the back area. Hey, it was the kind of interaction that happens in restaurants every single day and means nothing, Abbott argued. The argument moved outside onto the street, and there Jack Abbott stabbed Richard Eden to death. Richard Eden wasn't just a waiter working a shift. He was an aspiring actor and playwright, the son-in-law of the restaurant's owner, a young man whose own writing had just been accepted for production by the La Mama Theatre Company days before he died. 2 writers' lives intersected that night. One at the very beginning of his career, one supposedly rehabilitated at the tail end of his, and only one of them walked away. The timing was almost unbearable. The very next morning, July 19th, the New York Times Book Review ran its review of In the Belly of the Beast, glowing, calling it awesome, brilliant, perversely ingenuous. The reviewer had no idea that the author being celebrated in print was, at that exact moment, the subject of a manhunt for murder. Abbott ran. Federal authorities and police searched for months. He was finally captured in Louisiana on September 23, 1981, and indicted 2 weeks later. At trial, Abbott chose to represent himself. "You totally did." He testified at length about his childhood in foster care, about decades inside the prison system, admitting to the killing, but arguing, essentially, you totally did, over degree and intent, that there hadn't been sufficient evidence he'd meant to kill Adan, that a single stab wound was proof of self-defense rather than murder. On January 21st, 1982, his 38th birthday, he was convicted of first-degree manslaughter. On April 15th, 1982, he was sentenced to 15 years to life. The literary world spent a long time trying to figure out where the blame belonged. Mailer took heavy public criticism for championing Abbott's release. So did his editor, and the editor of the New York Review of Books, who'd helped bring his letters to a wider audience in the first place. But Richard Adan's father-in-law, Henry Howard, pointed his anger somewhere else entirely. At the parole system itself, for handing release decisions to pressure from famous names, rather than sober risk assessment. Sober risk assessment. Abbott, for his part, never really expressed remorse, not at trial and not afterward. In 1987, he published a second book, My Return, which sold poorly and offered no apology, only grievance. Abbott framed himself as a victim of the followed-him, Zuftum, and of being treated, arguing society owed him, for how he'd been treated. In 1990, Richard Adan's widow sued Abbott civilly. Representing himself again, Abbott cross-examined her directly on the stand. At one point, examined her crying. At one point, criticizing her for crying while testifying about her husband's death. The jury awarded her family $7.5 million in damages. Under New York's Son of Sam law, which prevents criminals from profiting off the crimes that made them famous, Abbott was barred from keeping any proceeds from the book his crime had helped sell. The advance, $12,500, was the only money he'd ever see from it, and even that was ultimately swallowed by the judgment against him. Abbott went before a parole board one final time in 2001. He was denied. His record, his disciplinary history, and above all his continued refusal to express genuine remorse for what he'd done, all counted against him. On February 10th, 2002, guards found Jack Henry Abbott dead in his cell at Wende Correctional Facility near Buffalo, New York. He had hanged himself using a makeshift noose made from a bed sheet and a shoelace. He left behind a suicide note. Its contents were never made public. His family initially doubted it was suicide at all. His sister told reporters he wouldn't have killed himself that way. But two separate coroners, one hired by the state and one hired by the family, both reached the same conclusion. Jack Abbott was 58 years old. Norman Mailer, hearing the news, released a short statement calling Abbott's life tragic from beginning to end, saying he'd never known a man who'd had a worse life. Others who studied Abbott closely, including a writer who reviewed his second book and later read his private legal filings, came away with a colder read. That Abbott was a man who never once, in any document he ever wrote, referred to Richard A. Dunn by name. Only the deceased. A man who had, whether by instinct or design, mastered the exact language needed to describe a killing without ever once admitting responsibility for it. That's the story of Jack Henry Abbott, a man whose prison letters convinced America's literary elite he'd been transformed, and who proved within on the page and change in the man are not the same thing at all. Eva, if you want more cases like this, the ones where redemption turns out to be a story someone told better than they lived, subscribe to Faceless Storyteller and turn on notifications every week. Because Faceless Crimes runs a new case lick. And if you've got thoughts on where the responsibility really lies in this one, drop them in the comments. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next case.